Well, welcome to the Jacob Hornberger Show on this 4th of July weekend. Nice to be back with you all, and thank you for tuning in or watching this program later on if you're watching it recorded. Nice to be here with you on this holiday weekend. The 4th of July has some important lessons for Americans, and I dare say lessons that many Americans probably never think about. So I thought I'd talk about some of those lessons and integrate them in with what's going on in America today. We've often been taught, especially in the government schools that most of us attended, that those men who signed the Declaration of Independence were great Americans. Well, nothing could be further from the truth, simply because they were not Americans. They were often taught to believe that, the Americans were fighting some foreign power, the British Empire. Not so. They were British citizens that were taking up arms against their own government. They were as British as you and I are Americans. They had sworn allegiance to the British crown. I mean, everything about citizenship, they were it as far as Great Britain was concerned. They took up arms against their own government. Imagine that. They were not supporting the troops, they were shooting the troops, and the troops were shooting back at them. Now, obviously there's going to be some people that say that these guys were terrorists, that they were just no good, that they were bad guys for taking up arms against their own government instead of supporting the troops, which many of the colonists did. I think it's been estimated that a third of the colonists stood by their government, loyal and what they consider to be patriotic. And I think a third's been estimated to have remained neutral, not choosing sides. But about a third said, no, we're going to take up arms against our own government. And, that type of thing of standing up against one's government obviously takes a lot of courage. We often see in times of crisis or war and so forth where the people that are siding with the government start criticizing the people that are not siding with the government, saying, oh, y'all are a bunch of cowards because you don't want to go to war, And actually, there's nothing courageous about standing with your government. I mean, it doesn't take any courage to stand with your government in times of war or whatever, because your government's not going to do anything bad to you if you're supporting them, if you're standing with them. Actually, the courage comes about from people like who signed the Declaration of Independence, who take on their government when they believe that their government is engaged in grave wrongdoing. And that's what these men believed, and it was obviously true. The British Empire, the British government, was engaged in great wrongdoing. They were, overtaxing the citizens to finance their foreign wars, their ever-growing expenditures. They were violating people's privacy rights and civil liberties with general warrants, search warrants, where they just go into people's houses and barge in and start looking for evidence of a crime. It was getting to be a very, very tyrannical society over here. And the government wouldn't change. It just would not change. It said, we need the money. We've got to have the money. How are we going to finance our foreign wars if we don't keep, collecting the Stamp Act and the tea tax and all the other taxes? Their needs were voracious because they had this great big empire with all of its foreign wars that they needed to finance. And then, of course, they were constantly paranoid about the British citizens over here avoiding their fair share of the taxes and so forth. And so they had these warrants where they were barging in people's houses and searching for evidence of a crime and so forth. And so in my mind, I think in the minds of most Americans, these people, the ones that signed the Declaration, were the genuine patriots. But that's not the way the British government saw them. The British government considered them just to be common criminals, traitors, unpatriotic, not supporting the troops, shooting the troops. And but and I'm sure there's some people today. I don't know if any Americans would dare say, "Hey, I think the colonists were wrong. I think they should have stood by their government, supported their government, and tried to get the system changed where they could get elected to office and so forth." I think there's some British people that would say, hey, they were wrong to do this. The genuine patriot loyally stands with his government, right or wrong, or even better, the loyal, good little citizen says, my government never wrong, especially in times of crisis and war. But I take the position, I think libertarians take, well, I know libertarians take the position that genuine patriotism involves standing up, having the courage of your conviction, standing up against the government when your government is engaged in grave wrongdoing, and pointing out that wrongdoing and objecting to it. Another lesson of the 4th of July deals with freedom. What's fascinating about this weekend is that Americans are celebrating a concept of freedom that is totally opposite from the concept of freedom that Americans celebrated for more than 100 years when they were celebrating the 4th of July. Isn't that fascinating? You've got two opposite versions of freedom. You've got the version of freedom from 1787 to, the early 1900s. And then you've got the version of freedom from primarily the 1930s, but even before that, up through today. And they're opposites. And yet, both sets of citizens is celebrating it as freedom. In fact, I often think that if all of our ancestors back in the 1800s and early 1900s were brought back to life all of a sudden, there very well may be a civil war because they would never have tolerated what Americans today consider freedom. That is the way of life that Americans have brought into existence in the 20th century and, of course, in this century. Now, of course, we set aside slavery and we set aside tariffs and a lot of minor exceptions. But, for the average person, here they lived in a society when they celebrated the 4th of July in which there was no income tax. Imagine that. No IRS. People just, they'd engage in economic enterprise. They'd open up businesses. There was no licensing laws. There was no permits. There was no government control over who could open up businesses or not. And there weren't government inspectors, inspecting whether the business was, setting the correct prices and setting this amount of wages and so forth. No, it was just total free enterprise. In fact, that's what free enterprise meant and still means. It's free of government control. It doesn't mean like it's free where, you give it away, it doesn't cost anything. It's free enterprise meant enterprise that was free of government control. And that was a startling idea to the world because, throughout history, governments have controlled enterprise. And so, here you go for 100 years where there's no controls on enterprise, there's no income tax, so when people engaged in enterprise, they got to keep it all. They didn't have to worry about, what's my deductions, how much interest am I paying on my house, oh, let me figure out all my little thing. They didn't need to rush down to the post office and file their tax return every April 15th, because there was no, income tax return. There was no IRS to terrorize people, to drive people into bankruptcy or suicide or things that the IRS does today. And then you had no economic regulations to speak of. You can always point to exceptions, but by and large, enterprise, as I said, was free of government control. You had no paper money and no central bank, no Federal Reserve System. They had sound money, gold coins and silver coins, copper coins. This was, when you combined these two things, sound money and no income tax, there's a large portion of your explanation for the tremendous soaring of the standard of living of the American people in the 1800s. It just shocked the world to the point where, thousands of penniless immigrants from all over the world, Italy, France, Germany, Japan, China, were flooding American shores every day. By the way, no immigration controls either. This was another remarkable thing. When you combine these things, an influx of immigrant labor that has a vitality to it, an energy, entrepreneurship, a willingness to work, to sustain one's life, to support one's family with no income tax, enterprise free of regulation, sound money. This is the key. This was the key to wealth and prosperity for the American people. I mean, in one 20-year period, I think it was around 1870 to 1890, it's my understanding that real wages, and I'm not talking about inflationary wages, real wages, what the purchasing power of their money could do, doubled, and then doubled again in that 20-year period. I mean, it was an absolutely incredible period. Okay. Oh, no warfare empire. Like no great big standing army, no military-industrial complex, no Cold War, no communist threat, no terrorist threat. None of those official threats that they use to justify today. The huge empire and no foreign military bases. I mean, they believed in a republic, not an empire. I mean, they had just revolted against an empire. They didn't like the idea of empire. They didn't like the idea of militarism. They didn't like the idea of a standing army. I mean, you can look at all the things that the framers talked about when they were bringing the federal government into existence, and among those that they really hated was this idea of a huge military to go abroad. In what John Quincy Adams, when he gave his speech on the 4th of July to Congress, he said, this is a government that does not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. In other words, there's a lot of tyrants and tyranny and bad guys around the world, monsters, as he put it. But this is a government that does not go abroad in search of those monsters and in search of trying to destroy them. That instead, what it does is it just protects life, liberty, and property here at home. You have a society of people freely interacting with, again, exceptions. And becoming a model of freedom for the people of the world, but with the message being sent forth, hey, if you're suffering under tyranny, if you're suffering oppression or starvation, famine, our government won't come and get you. They won't come and save you. We won't drop bombs on your wives or your children in trying to save you, and we won't say, hey, it was a good sacrifice. We bombed your wife, but hey, man, we saved you. None of that. It was instead, our borders are open to you. You get out and you got a place to come, and we won't send you back. Because the other countries had immigration controls, so they said, oh no, if you get out of this tyranny and you come to this country, we're just going to send you back. Well, think what that does to hope. But if people knew that there was a country where they could go that wouldn't turn them back, that gave them hope. They said, okay, well now there's a chance. And that was America. And so you can get a sense that when people celebrated the 4th of July, let's say in 1895 here in the United States, they were celebrating something completely different, a way of life where no income tax, no Social Security, no Medicare, no Medicaid, no systems of public schooling to speak of. Okay, there were some exceptions. You had a compulsory attendance law in Massachusetts, surprise, surprise. But by and large, nobody was forced to educate their children the way that you got it today. I mean, these people believed in liberty, educational liberty, economic liberty, no gun control. I mean, this was a remarkably different society. It was absolutely, I think it's the most amazing society that has ever come into existence. But of course, all that was abandoned. In the 1913, you get the income tax, national income tax, where effectively the federal government nationalized people's income. I mean, everybody's income now is available to the government. I mean, whatever the Congress says shall be the tax, which is how much they're going to take from you, or really how much they're going to let you keep, and the operative word is let, they make the call. And then that happened in 1913. You got a central bank, the Federal Reserve, which they said, was to stabilize the money system. Nonsense. The primary purpose of the central bank has been what it has been throughout history. It's to enable government officials to spend to their heart's content and send a nation into massive amounts of debt, and then just have the central bank print the money to pay it off. So that's why you've had, over the decades, massive destruction of the money system in the United States. That's why you don't see circulating silver coins anymore, right? You get these cheap little alloy coins, because the more you debase the currency, the more you drive out the good money. That's why the value of a dollar is worth a nickel compared to what it was in 1913, because they just kept flooding the money system decade after decade with newly printed money. And so you've got that system, which is really just a socialist system. It's central planning. You've got systems of widespread public government schooling, where the government's in charge of children's education and where people are forced to send their kids into this system. Okay, there's exceptions, homeschooling or private schools, but even the private schools are oftentimes not any better. They got to get licensed, right? So if they're not teaching the right things, they could have their license yanked. But everybody's got to get this government-approved education, and of course that goes to the core of the problem, is that a lot of Americans think that this is all free. I mean, remember I said that there's been these two conceptions of freedom? Well, the freedom that Americans believe in today, that they're convinced is freedom, is the extent to which the government is taking care of them and protecting them from all the scary people in the world. I mean, isn't that what Social Security is all about? And Medicare and Medicaid and education grants and farm subsidies and corporate bailouts and Wall Street bailouts. It's government taking care of the people, right? Giving them free money. Well, of course, we libertarians know it's not free. It's a war where government is the fiction. This is what Frederick Bastiat, the 19th century great free market legislator, said, that government's a fiction by which people are trying to live at the expense of other people. And that's what all these welfare state programs are. But that's what is defined as freedom today. That, if the government's taking care of me, I'm free. Oh my gosh, I get my retirement check and I'll put it in and I got a right to get it back. But everybody's blocking out of his mind that it's not an IRA account. It's not a savings account. Their money's gone. What they're really saying is, people took my money over my entire lifetime. They took my money in the form of income taxation and Social Security, and they used that money. They feathered their own nest. A lot of those people are now dead. And then they're saying, well, they did it to me, so I got a right to do it to my children and my children's friends and my grandchildren. And I don't care if their life's miserable. And they disguise all this in terms of saying, oh, but it's the government. The government owes me this. The government owes me this. Well, government's the fiction. It's really what they're saying is, I'm going to make if my kids have to suffer, if their friends have to suffer, tough luck, because I'm entitled to these things. That's why they call them entitlements. I'm entitled to get into the pockets of my children and their friends and my grandchildren and so forth. And so what if they can't start a family? So what if they're suffering? So what if they can't get a job? And that's really what's going on. And that's what people define as freedom today. The extent to which they can get into the pockets of other people. In other words, they're free to use government to get into other people's pocketbooks and savings account and income and so forth. To me, it's a very destructive system. It's a very immoral system, and it inculcates this sense of helplessness and dependency. I mean, how many times do you hear people saying, oh, I could never survive without Social Security. Oh, we have to gradually get rid of it. Oh, Medicare and Medicaid, oh, we'd have to gradually get rid of it sometime over the next 50 years. Well, this is nonsense. Those of us that believe in freedom, we know that freedom works. And, God has created a consistent universe. Not only is freedom based on moral principles, freedom of choice. You keep your own money. You decide what to do with it. But it produces good results. And you got to have faith in people. You got to have faith in yourself. You got to have faith in others. And you got to have faith in God. And you got to have faith in freedom. And unfortunately, a lot of Americans just don't have that. And the reason for that is this dependency, this mindset of dependency. And so, I think it's a bogus concept of freedom that we have today. I mean, it's just as bogus in Cuba. That's the same concept of freedom in Cuba. I mean, Americans don't realize that because they think that their mindset's different from the mindset in Cuba. It's not. In Cuba, the government exists to take care of people. I mean, look at Hugo Chavez. He's over there getting health care from the state. I mean, that's the whole idea of socialism, that the state's going to take care of you. And of course, everybody in Cuba is on the verge of starvation. And that's not a coincidence. You see, let's talk about this debt ceiling for a minute, and I'll bring it back in and show you the context, the relationship here. But okay, they're still, talking about the debt ceiling. The Republicans are saying, no new taxes. There's not going to be taxes, and I think they're going to cave. I mean, I like the stand they're taking. I wish they would take a stand that says no more raising the debt ceiling. Because what's the point of having a ceiling if you're going to keep raising it every time it comes due? I mean, then it's not a ceiling anymore. It's a fraud because you're letting people think it's a ceiling when actually there's no ceiling at all. But I think they're going to cave when push comes to shove. But what's Obama saying? Oh, well, he's demanding as a condition of making a deal, taxing the rich. Right? Isn't that what he's saying? Now, when he talks about taxing the rich, he's talking about taxing the middle class too. I mean, these people, they've got this welfare state, this warfare state. They don't want to let it go. It's their beloved little creature that they brought into existence in the 20th century, going all the way back to the 1930s and even before. And the thing is now cracking. I mean, it's cracked apart in Greece. I mean, the system in Greece is no different in principle than the system here. And in fact, no different from the system in Cuba. And in Cuba, it all imploded because what Castro did really was no different from what Obama wants to do. I mean, the truth is that their mindsets, Obama's and Fidel Castro, are really not any different in principle. They both believe in taking from the rich and giving to the poor, right? And you see, Castro actually was more consistent than Obama. Castro said, oh, don't just tax the rich, take everything from the rich. And so they nationalized all the businesses in Cuba. They took away people's homes. They confiscated all their bank accounts. They took everything from the rich. Okay? Now, for a while, everything was, party time. Hunky-dory. Can you imagine all these millions of dollars coming into the coffers of the state and property and beautiful homes? And, they were putting poor people in the homes, 3 or 4 families at a time. And, that, socialist paradise had arrived, Well, yeah, except that, now all the rich are leaving, have left Cuba. They were leaving at the time. The productive people didn't want to sit around, and government was running things into the ground. Even when they hired some of the previously successful entrepreneurs to run the government-owned businesses, there's no incentive. There's no entrepreneurial spirit. There's no means by which to discover what consumers want. I mean, this was the fatal defect that Ludwig von Mises talked about in socialism, the calculation debate. How do you calculate in a socialist system when the state owns everything? How do you set prices except arbitrarily? Because there's nobody buying and selling and trading in order to establish market prices, and that's how people calculate. So the whole thing was just caving in Cuba. It's caving in Greece, okay? I mean, very simply, what's happening in Greece? Well, the government spends much more on its welfare system than it brings in taxes. I mean, it's as simple as that. It's like your family. You go out and spend $200,000 this year and you got an income of $100,000. You got to figure out some way to cover that other $100,000. Credit cards, going to the bank and borrowing. And you can keep rolling over that note for a while, but finally the bank's going to say, we're getting a little nervous here. We want our money. And that's what happened with Greece, is that their debt, which they kept secret, got so large that they couldn't cover it, they couldn't pay it, and all of a sudden the speculators start figuring out things. They're the first ones. I mean, you often hear the government blaming the speculators. The speculators are the ones that let people know of the fraud and the deception and the secrecy. I mean, they're the heroes, are the speculators. They give message to the signal that the government doesn't want people to know the truth. So that's what happened in Greece, and so the speculators let people know that they've been lying to them about this massive debt. But what do the Greek people do? They take the same position as, oh, by the way, the British people are now doing, or some of the British people, and of course many Americans do, that they're protesting, some violently. We have a right to this money. So you've got this sector of the economy that is taking money from the state, that the state is taking from the private sector. So, I mean, you've got the productive sector and you've got the parasitic sector, okay? And so the parasitic sector, the one that's feeding off the host, is saying, we want our money, we want our money. Well, the problem is that the host is like sick. It's like a tick on a cow. And the tick, for a while, man, he's as happy as, a tick on a cow, He's just sucking blood like crazy. But finally, he sucks so much that the cow starts to teeter. And so as the cow's teetering, people say to the tick, stop sucking so much blood. Let the cow recover here. And the tick says, I have a right. I've grown dependent on this blood, and I'm going to keep sucking, and you fix it yourself. And so while, they inject some, hormones into the cow. That's what these bailouts are all about. And the cow gets revitalized and stuff. But all of a sudden, that tick just keeps sucking and sucking, and bigger and bigger and bigger. It's not just the same rate of sucking. I mean, they're voracious, these ticks. And so finally, the cow's just teetering, and the cow goes down, and of course, the tick dies too, because he's got no more fresh blood to suck. Well, that's what the Greek people, I don't know, I was going to say they don't realize it, but maybe they do realize it. I read in the paper the other day that 1/4 of the workforce works for the government, like some 800,000 people or so. And so, they're over there saying, don't cut our salaries, don't cut our payroll, don't cut our staffs. We have a right to this. And what's really amazing is that many of the young people are out there protesting too. They don't have any idea that they're the victims. They're the ones that are paying for all this parasitic blood that's being fed to the parasites. I mean, what they really ought to be doing is just, abolishing departments, abolishing agencies, repealing the welfare state programs, admit that it's been a disastrous mistake, this socialist system. They don't want to do that. And now, you got people in Britain doing the same thing. I mean, sometimes you just hope that the productive class says enough's enough. We're going to terminate these programs. And people are going to get a job. If they're 70, they got to work, well, so be it. If they can't because they're physically disabled, well, then we turn to family, or we turn to church, or we turn to voluntary groups. I mean, that's what genuine charity is all about. It's not about this coercive apparatus of Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid. And to a certain extent, that's what's going on in America today. I mean, you got people saying, I got a right to Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid and grants and subsidies and bailouts and stimulus funds and so forth. And the system is teetering. I mean, everybody keeps talking about, this bankruptcy that's pending on the horizon. And then, we've got over here the warfare state too. I mean, that's just military welfare. I mean, you can look at the military-industrial complex. They get involved in these wars so they can make it look like they're all justified and everything, and that all the money that goes into their pockets, it's coming out of the taxpayers too. Make no mistake about it. That you've got these two sectors, the welfare state sector and the warfare state sector, that are feeding off the citizenry, the productive citizenry. And you've got huge amounts of money going into this warfare machine. And they're voracious, and they don't want to let go of their money. The welfare state sector doesn't want to let go of their money. And you got young people in this country, saying, oh, yeah, I don't think I'll be around. I don't think Social Security will be around when I grow up. Well, what a horrible attitude. I mean, what they're really saying is, gosh, my parents and the old people are making life miserable for me. And, boy, I sure hope that people have a lot of children, and I have a lot of children, so I can make life miserable for them when I get old too. I mean, that's what they mean when they say, they lament that Social Security might not be around, that they may not have the opportunity to plunder and loot the young people like the old people are doing today, and like the old people did to them when they were young. That's a horrible attitude. What young people ought to be doing is coalescing, saying, look, you old people chose socialism. Your predecessor chose socialism. We don't. You don't have a right to a socialist system. This is a representative democracy. We want a free market, unhampered market economy where charity is entirely voluntary. We reject socialism, and we're going to repeal all these programs, and you'll be fine. Don't worry, because freedom works. And maybe if all of those productive people got together and coalesced, maybe they could outvote the parasitic class, both in the military and the welfare state sector. But in any event, Obama's over there saying, tax the rich, take it from the rich. It's always this class envy stuff. I mean, that's what Castro did. He took from the rich. And you know, the thing about what people like Obama and Castro don't understand is that, and people, you know, the statists in Greece and Great Britain and everything, is that you know, this notion of condemning the rich and envying the rich and coveting what the rich have is just so destructive. I mean, it's just so destructive to a society. Actually, the best thing that people could ever do is to be grateful for the rich. I mean, the rich are tremendously beneficial to a society. When you start taxing and destroying your rich, as Castro did, your system starts to implode. Now, for one thing, a lot of the rich are previously poor people. You know, people who have made it. They've satisfied consumers, and they've made a lot of money, and they've become wealthy. So it's kind of interesting when they say, oh, well, you know, take from the rich to give to the poor. Well, these were the poor that became rich. And then they destroy them by, you know, continuing to tax and tax and tax. Well, the rich are the ones that provide massive amounts of capital in a society. And okay, how does that capital help people? Well, you know, this is what builds businesses to become more productive. You know, a farmer that you know, all his workers are out there using hoes, you know, to plant the fields and so forth. The farmer thinks, well, shoot, I'd like to get a tractor, but he doesn't have any savings. But the rich have savings. They put it in a bank. He goes to the bank, and the bank says, I can lend you the money to buy that tractor. You know, pay me interest on my note, and of course he's paying the depositor, the rich, and so this guy goes out and gets a tractor, and man, productivity increases tenfold. He's making 10 times the amount of money. He now, you know, is able to give higher wages to his workers. He's able to pay off that note. I mean, it's capital. This is what leftists, liberals, you know, the socialists, the statists, they don't understand that it's capital that is the key to wealth in a society. You know, you know, they're always saying, the liberals, oh, we got to abolish poverty. You know, how do we abolish poverty? You know, and so they think that this parasitic system of taking from the rich and giving to the poor is the way to abolish poverty. Actually, that's the way to ensure poverty. You know, I mean, if you want to ensure poverty, start taxing the rich, because inevitably the needs of the parasite get so large that you start taxing the middle class and you start taxing the poor, and all of a sudden the whole system starts to implode in on itself. Because again, you know, like our example with the cow starts to teeter because he's having so much blood sucked out of him. So the rich provide this capital base in a society that enables people to become more productive, causes real wages to soar. This is what was happening throughout the 1800s, where you had no income tax and no Social Security, Medicare and Medicaid, and warfare state, foreign bases and so forth. You had massive accumulations of capital, and this was the key to wealth. I mean, they actually discovered the key to ending poverty. Now, that's not to say that there's not poor people. I mean, there's people, you know, that are starting out in life that are poor. You know, they leave their family, they leave their parents, and they're starting out, they're poor. But in a dynamic, prosperous system with vitality and energy, everybody's got a chance. Everybody's got an opportunity. I mean, that's why those immigrants were flooding into American shores. They couldn't speak English. They didn't have a dime to their name, and they get out there and start working, all of a sudden accumulating wealth and, by the way, saving money themselves. Well, what Obama's doing is trying to preserve his beloved socialistic welfare state and their warfare state. This is what the statists are doing. That's why the Republicans are going to cave, because they're committed to preserving the welfare state and the warfare state as well. I mean, it's only the libertarians that are saying, no, dismantle these welfare state programs, repeal them, ditch them. It was a mistake to have gone down. This is not freedom. This is what Goethe, the great German thinker, called, you know, none are more hopelessly enslaved than those who falsely believe they are free. I mean, what better sentence to describe the plight of the American people? None are more hopelessly enslaved than those who falsely believe they are free. And that's what public schooling's done. It's convinced Americans that all this is freedom. You know, that the welfare state's freedom. You're free because the government's taking care of you and you have a right to the money. And the troops are over there defending your freedoms. You know, that's another favorite one where everybody's just convinced that this huge military empire. And did you see where Obama's now starting to use drones to bomb people in Somalia? I mean, how many countries is this government bombing now? I mean, you lose count, 5, 6, 7. I mean, who knows? They just bombing people here and bombing people there. And, you know, this has been going on how many years now? 10, 11? I mean, when does it all end? They just keep bombing people. And you know what? Those people, they just want the empire out of there. That's their goal. Get the empire out of their countries. And the empire is saying, tough luck, bud. We're going to stay here because we have a right to stay here. We're the American warfare state. We've got military bases in 130 countries, some, I don't know, 700 to 1,000 bases, and we have a right because we're the empire. See, they took over the place of the Roman Empire and the British Empire and the Soviet Empire. I mean, the best books in this area, if you haven't read them, I highly recommend them. I give you a great analysis of the problem that we're facing with the warfare state, and they're by Chalmers Johnson, who recently passed away. You've got Blowback, that was his first book, where he said, as we did at the Future of Freedom Foundation, you're going to have terrorist blowback, retaliation on American soil because of what the government's doing over there in the Middle East. This was before 9/11. And of course, he proved correct. We proved correct. We were saying the same thing. The second book, the Sorrows of Empire, and the third book, Nemesis, and his final book before he passed away was Dismantling the Empire. I mean, Johnson goes into the real crux of the problem. This American military empire, and all these people in the Middle East want is just get out of here. Leave us alone. But the U.S. empire says, no, we have a right to be here. We're going to be here, and we're just going to keep killing you and killing you and killing you until you finally accept the fact that the empire has a right to be here. You know, it was kind of interesting. I remember, I think it was Bolivia, where the empire was trying to establish a base in Bolivia, and the new president there said, well, fine, you can build a base here when we get the opportunity to build a Bolivian military base in the United States. Well, that went over like a lead balloon. But why not? I mean, why not let, all these foreign countries, Bahrain and Egypt and I don't know if we have bases in Egypt, but Kuwait and Iraq and Afghanistan, and let them have bases here all over America. How would you feel about that? Well, I got a feeling Americans wouldn't like that very much. Well, these people overseas, they don't like it either when these foreign military bases are there, along with all their bars and, what else these bases attract to them. So, there's a solution. It's just leave people alone, dismantle the military empire, dismantle the military-industrial complex. But the statists don't want that to happen. And that's why I think the Republicans are going to cave. I think this is all for show. You're going to see higher spending. They'll have some token cuts, but by and large, spending will continue going up because they're not going to let go of any of their welfare warfare state. The debt is going to continue soaring. You owe, I don't know, $45,000, $46,000. If you have a family of four, it's about $160,000, $170,000. Don't think that they won't ever come and collect it, because if things start to get serious, where it looks like there might be a default and people won't lend them any money, this is a voracious monster. I mean, it's not going to stop. And in Argentina, when the Argentine government was faced with this same problem, they started confiscating people's IRA accounts. Just temporarily, they replace it with a bond. They'll give you a savings, a little savings bond, but don't put anything past these people. They confiscated gold, remember? When they had this voracious monster that needed money to spend money for the advent of the welfare state in the 1930s, so they just went out and confiscated people's gold. I mean, it was no different from what Fidel Castro would do decades later. In fact, Castro maybe even gotten the idea from Franklin Roosevelt of just confiscate, money from the rich and everybody. Well, that's what they did with gold. They just confiscated the gold. They paid a cheap price for it, and they made it a felony offense. And so, if you think they won't confiscate IRAs, and you're living in la la land. I mean, the welfare warfare state is a voracious monster, and that's why we libertarians have been saying this, right, for decades. This thing is going to turn bad. And that's why we got to keep committing ourselves to dismantling these programs. Forget this stuff of minor cuts, reforms. You look at it as a moral issue. It's wrong to be doing this. It's wrong to be bombing people in all these countries and claiming that the empire has a right to have bases in their countries and supporting their dictators and all that foreign aid that goes into their pockets and Swiss bank accounts. And it's just wrong. And that's why it ought to stop, but it's also destructive. So let me turn to another subject here, though, that I was going to talk about last week, and I ran out of time, and that's the government's war on Google. I mean, this is part of this concept of the war on the rich, right? I mean, here's Google, a tremendously successful internet company, satisfied consumers out the gazoo. I mean, you talk about consumer satisfaction, I mean, Google has satisfied consumers with their product. Well, this drives statists crazy because, I mean, this is the rich, the classic rich, the Google rich. And so they have to do something about the rich because they say the rich get powerful and the rich can push their weight around and stuff. Well, this is just nonsense. This is absolute nonsense. Google doesn't have the power of government. It doesn't have a gun. Nobody forces anybody to use Google. It's all by choice. And they provide this opportunity, and everybody can say, look, I'm not going to use it if that's what they choose to do. I mean, that's what a free market's all about. The thing is that usually in a free market, people offer something so good that you say, I'd be crazy to pass this up. This is really, really nice. And but they make a lot of money, and this drives the statists crazy. I mean, this is part of this concept that we've been talking about hating the rich and coveting what the rich have and thinking, oh, this is so unfair. And remember, they did this to Microsoft, remember? When they went after, they sued Microsoft and said, oh, Microsoft's a monopoly. Oh, it's a great big company, and it's monopolizing the software industry and so forth. They did the same thing with IBM. And where is Microsoft today? Well, they didn't destroy it, but they sure did do a lot of damage to it. I mean, for one thing, Microsoft, didn't compete adequately in certain areas, like in the areas that Apple's in and so forth. But you're also dealing with a company that's crippled because of what the government's doing. So, you break its leg and all of a sudden it finds it difficult to compete. And they did the same thing with IBM. And they destroy these companies or they damage these companies, and then they sit there and wonder, oh, well, how come they're not as prosperous anymore? How come Microsoft just can't make it anymore? Oh, it must be the free market. It couldn't have been our lawsuit that went after them and made them spend, millions and millions of dollars defending it. And remember when they were claiming that Microsoft was a monopoly? I mean, this is ludicrous because you know what a monopoly is? A monopoly is when the government gives somebody the privilege of producing something, a good or service, and prohibits anybody from competing against them. That's what a real monopoly is. I mean, you look historically, that this is why people hated monopolies, that they were abusive, they were nasty, their products were shoddy, they didn't do a good job. Okay, you want an example? Take the Postal Service. I mean, there is your classic example of a monopoly, right? You've got government employees that are providing the service, the delivery of first-class mail, and if somebody goes out and opens up a competing business in the delivery of first-class mail, they will shut that person down faster than anything. You can talk about free enterprise and free competition and entrepreneurial spirit, and they don't give a hoot. They will walk into federal court, they will get an injunction, and they will shut you down immediately. Why? Because that's what a monopoly does. And that's why, you got to stand in those long lines and deal with sometimes, arrogant clerks, or anything, because they know that if you get unhappy, the only thing you can do is go to another division of the Postal Service, another postal station. You can't do like Here, you get upset with Toyota, you go over to Honda, or you go to General Motors, or you go over to Ford. You don't have those choices in the Postal Service because it's a monopoly. And if anybody tries to compete, they will shut them down immediately. That's what a monopoly is. That's not what Google's all about. This is a company that grows as Microsoft was growing, as IBM was growing, by satisfying consumers in the marketplace. Now, they may come up with an ingenious product that no one else has. Well, that's their right. I mean, it's their product. And so why shouldn't they benefit from that? If people don't want to buy it, they don't have to buy it. If people don't want to buy Microsoft software, they didn't have to buy it. And you can say, oh, but it was so attractive, Jacob. Well, yeah, it was. And so, people bought it. And they were free to make deals with computer companies to put in their software. I mean, this is what the free market's all about. It's the right to engage in economic enterprise freely and accumulate massive amounts of wealth. Well, now they're going after Google, and because it's wealthy, it's successful, and that hurts everybody. It's really ironic that you see these people saying, oh, big business, oh, and they rail against big business like Google or whatever, Microsoft, IBM, the big companies. But they never rail against the Postal Service. Why is that? Because here's your classic monopoly. It's a huge monopoly. Well, the reason they don't is because they idolize the government. The government's their God. The government's their daddy. The government gives them everything, And when you suggest that we ought to just dismantle the postal monopoly, leave it to the free market, all they say, oh, the people in the mountains, how would they get their mail? Oh, the people in the mountains, I mean, ridiculous. How do the people in the mountains get their milk? How do they get their clothing, How do they get their food? Somehow or another they get those. There's no monopolies in those areas. I mean, it's just absolutely ludicrous. Or take the Federal Reserve. I mean, there's another example of a monopoly. You try to compete in the production of money. They'll prosecute you. They'll put you in jail for competing against them. They're not going to allow competition in the delivery of sound money. Boy, I mean, that's their anathema. They need to control the money system so they can finance this ever-growing deficit spending. That way, when the money's debased and prices start rising, the average public school graduate reacts the same way he's been reacting since 1913. That it's the rich raising their prices. Oh, it's the gasoline station owner. Oh, it's big oil. Oh, it's OPEC. Oh, it's big business. Oh, it's speculators. Oh, it's greed. And of course, they blame all the rising prices on all those because the last thing they're going to do is think that it's the Federal Reserve that's debasing their money. And so they have no idea that inflation is caused by the government and as a result of this monopoly that the government has. And I've talked about it before. It's a socialist type of system. It's central planning. You got this board of commissars planning in a top-down command and control fashion the adequate supply of money in a system. It's ridiculous. I mean, it's what Friedrich Hayek would call the fatal conceit. The conceit that pretends that they have that kind of knowledge that would know how best to manage a money system that deals with millions and millions of transactions and millions of people. So there's another example is public schooling, right? I mean, there's a monopoly. Okay, yeah, there's homeschooling as an alternative, but that's not a viable alternative for a lot of people. They're not competent to homeschool. They don't have the ability to homeschool. They got to work oftentimes. There's private schools, but nobody can afford those. They're paying taxes for the schools. They don't have any money left to send their kids to private schools, except the rich. Like Obama. Obama's not going to send his kid in a public school. Notice the liberals never criticize Obama for that. But I guarantee you, Obama's not sending his kids into a worse system. He's sending them into what he considers a better system, which is the non-public school system. Well, I don't blame him. I don't criticize him. I mean, that's his. He's got to do what's best for his children. But why not let everybody have that opportunity? Just open up the education market to getting the state out of there and having a total free market in education. Let everybody have a good education, Mr. Obama. Open it up, abolish the school taxes, abolish the compulsory attendance laws. America's lived without those compulsory attendance laws for more than 100 years. Let us have freedom, freedom for education and economic liberty. I shouldn't say let us have freedom. I mean, acknowledge that these are our fundamental rights. I mean, that's what the Declaration of Independence is also all about that we're celebrating this weekend. Fundamental, inherent, natural, God-given rights that pre-exist government. We don't need to be thankful to these people that give us our rights. They don't give us our rights. Our rights pre-exist government. They come from nature and they come from God, and it's government, as a matter of fact, who's our servant. They're supposed to be our servant to protect the exercise of these rights, and of course they've inverted everything and become our master, and which again is what people celebrate as freedom. They're the servants and they're celebrating, oh, thank you, master, thank you for letting me be your servant. I never knew freedom till I came to serve you. Well, at least us libertarians know reality. We know the truth. We're not free, and we're trying to be free, and we know the way to get there, by dismantling these programs, not by reforming them or trying to fix them. I mean, if you got diagnosed with a cancerous tumor and the doctor said, well, okay, we're gonna gradually get rid of this tumor by cutting off 25% of it, what would you say? I mean, wouldn't you say, doctor, can we cut the whole tumor out? Yeah, we could cut the whole tumor out, but we shouldn't go too fast. Tumor's dependent. It's been in there quite a while. We're gonna cut off 10% every year. Well, that's ridiculous. I mean, you got a cancerous tumor, you take out the whole tumor, right? Well, that's the situation we got in America. You got these welfare state programs, you got these warfare state programs, the occupations, the invasions, the sanctions, embargoes, assassinations, kidnapping, rendition. That's the tumor. You got to get rid of the tumor, and then you get a healthy, vibrant body politic again. But in any event, so, I guess the theme of this program tonight has been, that this concept of freedom involves also protecting all classes in society, not just the poor, the middle class, but the rich also. That there's, contrary to what the Marxists and the socialists say, there's not this natural, tension, antagonism between, employers and employees, or rich and poor and middle class. There's a harmony of interests that exists within people in a free market, in a dynamic market. You got poor people becoming wealthy by serving others in the marketplace. You got the wealthy accumulating wealth, and now they have a lot of money to help out in charitable activities. That's how the opera houses got built, and the museums and the universities and so forth. So there's this harmony of interest that develop in a free market as compared to this constant strife and conflict and fear. I mean, look at the kind of society we're living in. Where you got everybody trying to get into everybody else's pocketbook with the welfare state. Everybody's afraid that the terrorists are going to come and get us and take over the public schools and the interstate highways, and they never come up with how they're going to do this. Like, where are the transport ships? Where are the transport airplanes? I mean, it's just this constant living in fear and all, so that the empire can maintain its bases overseas and continue occupying countries and regime change operations. This ain't any way to live, okay? I mean, this is why libertarianism is really the only hope for this country. It's the solution. I mean, that's what's so frustrating, is that, people, they as I stated in a previous talk here, they're in this status box, and they want a status solution to save statism. And we libertarians say, well, you can't save statism. It's a bad system. It's a bad paradigm. You got to break out of the box, and that involves libertarianism. And people say, oh, no, I'm scared of freedom. I'm scared of freedom. Oh, people will die in the streets with freedom. People won't get educated with freedom. Oh, my gosh, if there was no public schools, everybody would be stupid. Right? Or if there was no Social Security, everybody would be dying in the streets, or at least the old people would be here. If there was no Medicare and Medicaid, oh, everybody would be dying of illness, I mean, Or, if there was no military empire, oh gosh, the terrorists would be coming to get us. Well, of course, the terrorists are just retaliating for what the empire's doing over there. So, that's what's sort of frustrating sometimes, is here is the solution to America's woes. It's right here in front of you. Libertarian principles, which are the principles in 1776, July 4th. That was, what greater statement of libertarianism than, all men are endowed with certain fundamental, inherent, natural, God-given rights with which no government, not even the American government, not a democratic government, not a totalitarian government, can interfere with. What a great message. And that it's the purpose of government to protect the exercise of these rights, not damage them, not destroy them, not regulate them. It's the purpose of government to protect the exercise of these rights. And that when government becomes destructive of these ends, it's the right of the people to alter or abolish the government and implement new government designed to protect these rights. And this is what I'm saying about the young people and the productive people, is that we have the opportunity to remake America. And to do it entirely peacefully, where we just advocate these libertarian principles and we get them into effect. In other words, we outnumber the statists. That's what we're aiming for, where we outnumber them, and then all of a sudden you start seeing these statist programs being dismantled. You see this in large part with the drug war now. We are making big headway in the drug war. Look at all the major prominent people that are now calling for an end to the war on drugs. I said some years ago, of all the welfare state paternalistic things that are going to go first, I think the drug war is going to go first, and I still believe that, because people are finally starting to see what we libertarians have been saying for years, for decades, that this is a bad war. These are bad laws. They're kind of reforming them to a certain extent. I don't know if y'all saw where they're modifying the crack cocaine so that it matches the punishment for the powder cocaine. Well, that's nice. Everybody knows it was a racist thing from the get-go. The blacks couldn't afford the powder cocaine, so they came up with the crack cocaine, which would provide a bigger hit for a cheaper price, and which appealed to the poor people. And of course, they all knew this. Congress, the federal judges, the state judges, the prosecutors that were levying the heavy penalties on the crack users, they were all black, or mostly black, and it was a racist thing from the get-go. It still is. And and they're acknowledging that to a certain extent. It's nice that they're equalizing the punishment, but that's like cutting the tumor out, 25% of the tumor. You got to just legalize drugs, all drugs. Forget this legalized marijuana only, because then you still got the black market and cocaine and heroin and all the rest, methamphetamines and so forth. You got to legalize it all. You get rid of all the drug lords overnight, immediately. So, and then you don't need the DEA, and you don't need all, think of the money that can be saved. And then you get rid of all the violence in society. And so this shows you the power of ideas, that with libertarians just spreading these ideas and not compromising, with trying to chop off 25% of the tumor, that we've got to go for excising the entire tumor. That's what we need to do in the drug war, just legalize the thing. And that's what we need to do with the welfare state programs. Ditch them. Rely on the free market and voluntary charity and so forth. Dismantle the warfare machine, the militarism, the overseas bases. Bring all the troops home. Discharge them into the private sector. Ditch the income tax. Ditch the Federal Reserve. Have a free market in money, what Hayek called the denationalization of money. Herein lies the future of this country. And so on this 4th of July weekend, I think we should all reflect on these libertarian principles and recommit ourselves to spreading these ideas, because ideas matter. This is why that Chinese dictatorial regime are jailing individual people that are speaking out, because they know the power of ideas. They can sweep across a country, and they can transform a country as quickly as the fall of the Berlin Wall. That's the show for tonight. I had a great time talking to you guys as always, and thanks so much for listening in, and I'll see you next week. Thank you. Bye-bye.